Hey there. Today we're going to go ahead and take a look at implementing integration tests in a Nest.js API backend. Now, integration testing or end-to-end testing is an important component to a well-rounded testing suite as it tests an entire application from end to end. And we're not going to be mocking any part of the application like you would do in a unit test. Instead, we're going to be using the real database in the application. We're going to be interacting with the routes that we have set up, both REST API routes and GraphQL queries and mutations. So we're going to run these using a test tool called Supertest. We're going to go ahead and use this to make requests to our API, and then we can make assertions on the response that we get back to make sure that our application is working as expected. So let's go ahead and get started. Now I've gone ahead and started a new branch off of one of my previous repositories, Nest.js Mongo. And so this is because we already have a database set up in this project. So if you'd like to be caught up on how to implement MongoDB and the routes that we've already created in this project, be sure to check out my other video that I'll include in the description. So for this project, I'm on a new branch called Nest.js Mongo end-to-end start. So that's the branch that I'm currently on. You can see here, we're on end-to-end start. And at the end, I'm going to create a new branch called end-to-end finish. So if you'd like to start off from where we're starting, just check out the end-to-end start branch, and the repo will be in the description. Now, just a quick refresher. In this project, we have a users repository, which is a MongoDB database. We have a users service, which just has some simple methods that allow us to interact with the database with our persistence layer. And finally, this feeds to a users controller where we have REST API routes set up to get a user, create an update. Now, I've also added a users resolver so that we have a GraphQL interface to be able to interact with our user service, and I'll be able to show you how I implement integration testing for both REST API and GraphQL. So we've got this all set up in our app module here. Okay, let's go ahead and start off by creating a new folder in a users domain directory, and we'll call it test. Now, a test folder usually will contain a suite of unit tests, maybe some stubs, some support files, and integration tests. So to organize things a bit better, I'll create another folder in here called integration. This is where we'll keep all of our integration tests. Now let's go ahead and start with our users controller. You can name your test files however you'd like. I like following a pattern like this: users.controller.integration.spec, something like that, just so we can tell the files apart. Now I'm gonna wrap everything in a large describe block, and we're going to be using Jest as our testing framework here, which comes out of the box with Nest.js. Now, before we install Supertest or any other dependencies, let's just go ahead and set up the base of the test. So we'll have a large describe block describing the user's controller. Now, in our user's controller block, we're going to want to have another block here before all, and we want to make sure this runs before any of our integration tests run. It's going to be an asynchronous block here. And what we need to do now is get a reference. Well, first we need to create our Nest application. This is an integration test, so we want to create the entire application and initialize it. So to do that, we're first going to handle to the module ref by calling test.createTestingModule. And our imports are going to be the app module because we want it to load the entire application. And lastly, we're going to want to call compile on this, which will actually compile the module ref. Now that we have the ref, we can get the application. So to do that, we'll create a new const called app, and we'll set it equal to module ref dot create nest application. Now this is all we need to do. Now finally, we have to initialize this application. So start it, and we'll call await app.init. Now this is great because we can now get a reference to any of the services we need in the application with the module ref, but more importantly, now that our integration tests, before they run, the app itself will become started. Now let's go ahead and look at setting up our first test. So the simplest of the tests will be just getting all of the users. So let's go ahead and set that test up first. So we'll have another describe block here called get users. Now in this describe block, from a high level, what we want to be doing is we want to first set up the database to be in a certain state. So we want it to have a certain number of users, and we want to make sure that's the same every time we run this test. And secondly, we want to launch a request that will hit this API, return the users, and we can compare the result to what we have inserted before we ran this test to make sure they match. So the first thing we have to do is get our database in the state that we want it before we run this test. Specifically, we want to insert a user or a number of users that the API is expected to return to us in this test. So in order to do that, we need to get a reference to the underlying database in our application. Now, the easiest way I've found to do that is to have a dedicated database service which can hold on to a connection handle to the database. And that way you can get it easily in our tests, but also if you needed to get that handle elsewhere in the app, it would be easy to do so. So in order to facilitate this, I'm going to create a new folder called database. In database, I'm going to create a database.service. This is going to be an injectable, and we'll export it. Database service. And now for the constructor here, we are going to call inject connection. And this is from Nest.js Mongoose. So this will directly inject the connection that we have to our underlying database in this variable here. And this is going to be of type connection. This also comes from Mongoose. So make sure you import connection from Mongoose at the end here. So now we have a handle to the connection. We can add a helper method called getDBHandle, which returns the connection, and this will simply be a getter. We'll return this .connection. So now we have the ability to get the connection from anywhere in our app. Let's go ahead and just quickly create a database.module here, and all we need to specify is the database service we just created here. And let's go ahead and export it so that we can use it elsewhere in the application. And we'll go ahead and export it here, database module. Now lastly, let's go ahead and just add this to our app module. So now in our before all block, we want to get a handle to that database connection we just set up so that all of our tests can have access to it. So in order to do that, let's create a let at the top of this block here, and we will call this DB connection. Now let's go ahead and set the DB connection. So the DB connection is going to be equal to our module ref.get database service is the type of the service we're getting here. Let's pass in the database service and make sure we actually import this. And now we can call getDBHandle. So just to clarify, we're using the module ref to get our database service, and then we're calling getDBHandle, which we set up on it over here to get the connection. So now before all of our integration tests run, we're setting the DB handle before we create our application, or after we create our application rather. So now in get users, we can go ahead and actually insert a user before we run this test. So let's call await DB connection, and we will call collection. Make sure that this function here is also asynchronous, so we can use await. And for the collection, well, we know this is called the users collection. Now we're going to call insert one, and now we need to pass in the user document that we expect. Now we could just define the user document right here and pass it in, but it's going to be cleaner if we can have a stub that we define somewhere else, and then we can use that stub across multiple tests in multiple places, and if we ever update it, we only have to update it once, opposed to all of these different places where we use the user stub. So to see what I mean a little bit better here, I'll create a new folder in our test folder called stubs. This stubs folder will have a user.stub.ts, and I'm going to export a const user stub. Now this is actually going to be a function that returns a user, and the reason for that is because we want to make sure that each time we return this user stub, it's a new copy, so that if we mutate it in one of our tests, it doesn't affect that in another test. So let's go ahead and return the user stub. We need a user ID. We need a user ID, email, age, and favorite foods. So now we have our user stub set up. Let's go ahead and go back to our integration test, and let's go ahead and call user stub. So this will call the user stub function, which returns us a new user object, and we insert it into our collection. Now, before we go ahead and run this test and start inserting things into our database, let's go ahead and make sure that we are actually using the correct database. If we go ahead and look at our app module, we can see here that when we instantiate or initialize our Mongoose module, our Mongoose database, we provide it with a hard-coded URI to the database we want it to connect to. Now in production we have one database. This might be okay, but now that we're using integration tests, which will directly interact with the database, insert and remove things, we don't ever want the integration tests to interfere with our production data. In fact, we want these integration tests to have their own dedicated database that is totally separate from our production or QA data. So in order to do this, we can take advantage of Nest.js configuration to provide the connection URI depending on if we are running a test or if we are in production. So to see how we do this, I'm actually going to go ahead and move the instantiation or initialization of Mongoose, and I'm going to move this to the database module just because it makes more sense to be doing this here in the database module. So I'll also go ahead and move the Mongoose module import. The Mongoose module, it takes another function here called forRootAsync, and instead of providing a hard-coded URL, forRootAsync takes an object which has a useFactory property. Now useFactory allows us to inject services into a factory method so that we can use these services to determine what connection URI we want. And in this case, we want to make use of Nest.js configuration service or config service. So if you don't have this already, which we don't have in this project, let's go ahead and add Nest.js/config. And all this is a helper service or module that aggregates all of our configuration in our app into one module. And so by default, all these values will read from a .m file, and we'll be using that in a second. So now that we have the config service or the config module, we'll add it here as a parameter to useFactory. We'll go ahead and import it from config service from Nest.js/config. And now we can finish our error function here. So useFactory, it then takes an object that we return and it needs the URI. So now we can say to the config service, we can call config service.get. This is going to be a string, and we want to get the environment variable called node_env, which node will automatically populate for us depending on if this environment is running in production or if it's a test environment. So we want to say if this comes back as test, then we want to call config service.get, and we want an environment variable that we will define ourselves in a second, Mongo test connection URI. Otherwise, we are going to use another string, and this is going to be Mongo connection URI. This will be our production URI to connect. Now lastly, we need to provide another property here to our useFactory where we provide it what services that we're injecting. So in this case, it's the config service that we need to inject into the factory. So in summary, we are telling Mongoose to look at the config service. If the node env is test, we use the test database URI. Otherwise, we'll use the production URI. So now let's go ahead and actually define these URIs. So to do that, I'll create a .m file in the root of our directory. And typically, you'd never want to include .m in version control. We would want to keep this out of version control because you'd hold sensitive data in here, so you'd add the git ignore. But for this purposes, I want to keep the .m available for you watching at home, so I will not git ignore it. But in production, you definitely would. So let's go ahead and add our two environment variables. The first of which is the production connection URI, which is just the same as we had it in the app module before. And secondly, we'll add another URI, and this time we will change it to, and we'll give it a different database name. This time we will call it test. So we'll go ahead and save that, and I'll actually call this demo test just to make it more clear. So now when we start our application and Mongoose looks for the connection URI, when we're in test, it should use the connection URI we defined in our M file. So before we go ahead and run back to our integration tests, I just noticed when I started the application that the Mongoose module complained it couldn't find the config service, and that's because in the app module, in order to do that, we call config module, and we import this from Nest.js config, and we're going to call for root here. And we're going to actually specify that it's a global module because we want to provide it in every other module without having to re-import it. So now at this point, we're actually ready to use Supertest, which is an integration testing library that will allow us to send requests to our API in these just tests and then make assertions on the response we get back. So I'll include the docs of Supertest in the description. There's a lot you can do with it, but in this tutorial we'll use pretty much the bare minimum of it to just, let's go ahead and add Supertest. I'll also go ahead and add the types for it. So we'll add types Supertest, and this is a development dependency. Now we're going to go ahead and create a new const here called the res, standing for the response. So we can call it response, and we'll call request, and we're going to import request from Supertest. So I'll go ahead and add that up top here, request from Supertest. Now the request takes in the HTTP server. So in order to do this, up here, let's create a new let called HTTP server. In our before all block, let's go ahead and call HTTP server, or not call, but we'll set the HTTP server to app.getHTTP server. So now we have the server and we can pass it into the request. Next, we're going to go ahead and provide it with the method that we want to execute, the HTTP method. So in this case, it's a get method, and we need to provide it with the URL. So this is going to be a relative URL to our application. So if we go look at our users controller, we can see that we have users, and then it's just that's it for our get all users. So we will pass in, and that's all we have to do in order to get a response back. Now I'm gonna add an await here so that we get a response and we actually wait for it, because it's going to be asynchronous. And now we can do the expect on this response. So first and foremost, let's expect response.status to be at 200 so that we expect the call to be successful. And next we're going to go ahead and expect that the response.body is going to equal an array, and this array is going to be just consisting of our user stub, because if you remember at the beginning of the test we inserted a single user, and the way our service works is that it returns all of the users in the database as an array. So this is our test that we've set up. Let's go ahead and run it. Now actually, before we go ahead and run this test, there's going to be one more thing we want to do, and that's the actual cleanup work involved with our tests. So there's a couple of things that we want to clean up when any of our tests finish. So after all, the first thing we want to do is we want to clear out our database from our tests, from all of our test data, so that the next time we run the tests, the database is completely empty. So in order to do that, we'll call it await db connection.collection. It's the user's collection, and let's call remove delete many, and we'll pass an empty filter query in here so that the entire database or the entire collection gets deleted. And the next thing we have to do is close the connection to the app. So in order to do that, we'll declare another let up here. Instead of declaring a new const for the app, we will just specify the app up here. So we're setting the app, and now in the after all, we can call app.close, and this will close the Nest application after our tests finish, so we don't have any hanging tests at the end. So the last thing we have to do is we have a describe block with our test in here, but we actually need to declare another test block, so we can use it or expect. In this case, I'm going to declare an it and said it should return an array of users. And we can remove this async, change the async to the it, and let's just move this test code into our it block so that Jest will be happy. And so there's going to be one more thing we actually want to do before we run the test, and that's just up here. We're going to want to change the import from Supertest to import star as request from Supertest. And at that point, we can finally go ahead and run yarn tests. So if we go ahead and look at the output of this test file, or the output of the test, we can see the test fails because we're expecting the stub to look like what we have here, but it also has an additional property of ID that comes back. And the reason for this is because when we insert the user, the ID is automatically generated by Mongo, and when it comes back, we don't know what that ID is going to be. So instead of expecting the response to exactly equal the user stub, we can use .object containing, or to match object. So what this says here is that we're going to check that the object matches a subset of the properties of an object. So let's do that. So we'll pass in the array, and we'll have the user stub here. So now if we get extraneous properties like the ID, the test will still pass if and only if the values on the user stub match what is in the database. So let's go ahead and run this test again. So now we can see the test is passing, and we're getting back an array of users. Additionally, the response status code is 200. So this is great. Now we are asserting and making sure that our API is running as expected. So now let's go ahead and set up our test for create user. Now something I just noticed is that we actually want to move this line here to a before each block instead of after all. And this is because after or before each test runs, that's when we want to clear the database out and make sure that each test is independent of one another. So that's a very important aspect of tests in general, that we want to be able to run them in any order without having them depend on each other. So in order to do that, we want to clear the collection, the user's collection, out before each test. So now in the describe block for create user, let's have a test block here, and we'll say it should create a user. This will be asynchronous. And this is going to work almost the opposite as get users. We are going to send the request. We're going to send the request to create the user, and then we're going to check the database to make sure that the user is there. So let's go ahead and do just that. We'll have a similar flow to up top, and we'll have a new const here called response. Call it await request, pass in the HTTP server, and this time we're going to call post because our create user function is a post, and this is going to be /users. And now in order to provide a body, we're going to use the send function here, the send method, and we're going to pass in the data that this route expects. So if we go ahead and look at the request, we can see it takes email and age. So let's provide that here. And so what we're going to do is use the user stub we have set up, call that, provide the email, and age will be user stub.age. So now let's go ahead and make sure that the response.status, we want the status to be a 200. And additionally, we want to make sure the response body at least matches the properties that we passed in here, because when we create the user, we return the newly created user back. So in order to do this, let's actually extract this out to our request here, and we can actually import the type, and we can define the create user request. Let's pass in create user request, and now we can match the object we get back to the create user request to make sure that at least those properties look okay. So this is okay, this is great, but we want to actually now make sure that the user is indeed in the database. So in order to do this, we have the database connection, look for the user. So in order to do that, we'll call await db connection dot collection users, and let's find one, because we're just looking for one user. And this one user, well, we know that it should have the email of create user request dot email. So this user should now exist because we've inserted it via this API. So let's expect, similar to what we did up here, let's expect now the user to match the object of create user request. So if this user comes back as undefined, well, this will fail. So let's go ahead and run this test and see if things work as expected. So we can see that the test failed because we actually got a 201 status code, and that makes sense because this is a post request. So let's go ahead and update the test here. So we can see the test is passing, and now we have successfully created the user and we verified that it exists in our database. So this is great, and just to show you that our test is working as expected, let's just set the user equal to undefined here and run the test again and make sure that it now fails. This can be a good sanity check to do in your tests from time to time to make sure that they are actually working as expected. So we can see the test now fails, which is what we'd expect. So we can uncomment this out. So now that I've shown you how I set up my integration tests and shown you both how we'd use a GET request and a POST request, I urge you to finish this by writing integration tests for the GET user route and for the update user. I'll include the docs to Supertest in the description to help you out. If you have any questions, be sure to leave them in the description and I'll be definitely sure to help out. In the next video, I'm going to show you how to do the same setup but using GraphQL and our resolver here. It's quite similar, but I think it'll be a helpful exercise nonetheless. So I hope this video has helped you, and I'll see you in the next one.